Welcome back to Melbourne Vibe, guys. A lot of you guys before coming to Australia are confused which city you should move to, whether you should move to Sydney or you should move to Melbourne or any other city. So when we had gone to Sydney, we decided to ask people of Sydney what do they choose between Melbourne and Sydney, and everybody said Sydney. When we came back to Melbourne, we asked people in Melbourne what do they choose between Melbourne and Sydney, and everybody said Melbourne. And which is kind of obvious. You always want to choose your city when it is compared to any other city. So that's why we objectively chose the things that students compare. For example, rent, or how's the party scene, or how are the people there, or what's the culture like. And in this video, we're going to tell you what are the major differences and pros and cons of both the city, so that it becomes easier for you to choose which city you want to move to and you make the right decision. So if you want to know which is the right city for you, Melbourne or Sydney, this video is just for you. Check it out. Now I want you guys to write it in the comment section which one would you choose between Melbourne and Sydney. Coming back to the main question, what are the pros and cons of moving to either Sydney or Melbourne? Coming to rent, which is the major expense for any international students anywhere. So if we talk about Sydney, Sydney is the biggest city in the whole of Australia. And that's why the demand of housing is much higher than the supply, and that's why rent are crazy expensive. And that's why if you want a cheaper rent, you should move to Melbourne. Now, if we talk about Melbourne in specific, it is a very similar scenario, and Melbourne's rent is going high day by day, but it is not as expensive as Sydney. Also, Sydney is way bigger than Melbourne. If you want to travel from one end to another end of Sydney, it's not surprising that it will take at least 2 to 3 hours. Where in Melbourne, you can do that in 1.5 hours because it's not as big as Sydney. Now, one fun part about Sydney is that public transport also includes ferries. So you will literally be sitting in boat almost every day if you want. Wherein in Melbourne, they have trams which nobody else has. So Melbourne's best part is trams. It is not very fast, but it's very efficient and you'll love it. Now let's talk about partying. One very surprising thing in Sydney is the lockout laws. Now what is a lockout law? A lockout law is that you cannot enter a pub or a club after 1 a.m. So if you want to do bar hopping or club hopping or pub hopping, you can only do till 1 a.m. Whereas in Melbourne, there is nothing like lockout laws. So even if 3 o'clock in the morning, you feel like, oh, that club would be open, I want to go there. Well, you can, because nobody's going to stop you. Like in Sydney, they will not only kick you out at 3 a.m., but after 1 a.m., you just cannot enter any bars or club. That is lockout law. Moving further to the culture. Well, if you ask Sydney people, how do you find Melbourne's culture? They're going to say that Melbourne people are a little bit stupid. But surprising thing is that if you ask people in Melbourne, how do you think about Sydney people? They're saying that Sydney people are a little bit stupid. So guys, I have no idea what to say here, but you have to experience by yourself. Another thing is that Melbourne is quite laid back and slow compared to Sydney. Sydney is super fast, and that's what generally is like. Any major biggest city in any country is the fastest. And that's Sydney in Australia. So if you want a little bit laid back life, well, Melbourne is fast. I'm not saying it's slow at all, but a little bit slower than Sydney. Now, let's talk about culture and how many international students are there. Melbourne is extremely famous for its graffiti streets and the amount of museums that it has. Now, you'll love it because Melbourne has best film festival and all the things are constantly happening in Melbourne. Whereas Sydney is more of financial capital of the country. So they don't have as much culture as Melbourne has. And Victoria, which is the state where Melbourne is the education state. There are so many colleges and universities in Victoria that it has nearly 200,000 international students, and Australia has 600,000 international students, so which is 1/3 of the international students are just in Victoria and majority of them are in Melbourne. So if you want a larger international student community, Melbourne is the place for you. I hope that covers everything that you are thinking about and helped you make a decision between Melbourne and Sydney. Write it in the comment section, which one do you choose, Melbourne or Sydney? And don't forget to hit the subscribe button and turn on the notification bell. Share it with your family and friends so they can make an informed decision where do they want to move, Melbourne or Sydney. Hope you loved the video. Don't forget to hit the like button and welcome to Melbourne Vibe.